All right, so we're going to start standard 5 today, and this is going to deal with the Cold War. So it's the post-World War II era of American history. And we're looking at two essential questions. The first is 5CO, explaining the technological developments and economic changes in the United States during the Cold War and post-Cold War eras using comparative analysis. Fancy words for saying we're going to look at how technology and the economy changes from about 1945 to the modern era. The second one is 5CE, assess the immediate and long-term causes and effects through significant turning points of the Cold War. That's a very open-ended one. Basically, we're looking at causes and effects of various turning points. So, for example, we're going to look at Sputnik and how that was a turning point in the war. Now, to start things off, we need to understand a little bit about the Cold War itself, and we need to understand the president at the time and how the Cold War starts to develop. The president at the end of World War II, the one that actually made the decision to drop bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was President Harry Truman, and he's going to get reelected in 1946 or 48, I can't remember offhand. The origins of the Cold War start with World War II. The United States is a capitalist democracy. They believe in free markets, and they believe in buying and selling, and they're democratic in the sense that they want to have elections. That doesn't mean democratic in a sense of like Democrats or Republicans, but they believe in open elections in the U.S. The Soviet Union, by contrast, is a communist dictatorship. Now, communist is the idea that the people have the means of production. There is no private ownership. They tend to share out things equally in theory. In practice, the Soviet Union is a dictatorship. There is an upper class of communist leaders, and then everybody else is kind of on the bottom class. It is also a dictatorship, which means that the person in charge is essentially an authoritarian, has absolute power. We're going to start by looking at Stalin, and then that title is going to transfer over when he dies. The Soviet Union had a large mistrust of the United States after World War II because they lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 24 million people during World War II. 24 million people died. They called it the Great Patriotic War. And the Soviet Union distrusted the United States because the United States, first of all, delayed entry into the war for a couple of years. And secondly, once the United States did join, they didn't immediately have a successful second front. Remember over here in Germany, the Soviet Union wanted somebody to attack from the West to try to pull away soldiers from the East, right? The Nazis had gone all the way up into the Soviet Union and had surrounded Moscow, and that's what leads to the 24 million dead. The second thing is that Hiroshima saw Truman's decision to drop bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki as a threat to them, not to end with the World War II. In fact, there are many military analysts, even at the time, that said that Japan was about ready to surrender, that the dropping of the bombs was not necessary, that traditional incendiary bombs were doing as much, if not more damage, and that the use of the atomic weapon was a message sent to Stalin by Truman that the United States had the atomic weaponry and that they should fall in line. Whether or not that's true, it's not really the point. The point is that the Soviets distrusted the United States for those two reasons, which is going to lead to their desire to want to have a buffer zone between the United States and its allies in the West and Soviet territory. So this leads to what's referred to as the Iron Curtain. This line right down here in Europe where the West is not really able to gain entry, and the rest of the eastern part is controlled by the Soviet Union. So the Soviets control Eastern Europe, not necessarily directly. They do install some puppet governments here. They do practice authoritarianism there, and it is their territory. That Iron Curtain is in place. Remember that Berlin is also broken up. So you can see in East Germany, right here is Berlin, and Berlin is broken into East and West. Now, East Germany is in Soviet territory, and West Berlin is in East Germany. And Berlin, right here, is Eastern German territory. There's the Iron Curtain. The United States has a policy known as containment. They didn't think that they could wipe out the Soviet Union. They didn't know if they wanted to wipe out the Soviet Union. It would be in addition to all the death that was faced by Americans in World War II. But they did fear Soviet expansion, this fear that the bear is going to start encroaching on other Western allies. And they didn't think the military could destroy the Soviet Union, so they decided to just try to contain the spread, not let it expand beyond the borders that it already had. And one way to do that is to try to make it less attractive. One way that they tried to make communism less attractive was by supporting its allies by just giving them money. This is eventually going to be known as the Truman Doctrine, which was to support the free people who were resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressure, that outside pressure being the Soviet Union. So the Truman Doctrine was trying to support people that didn't want communism. The Marshall Plan was the way that they came up with running the Truman Doctrine. And the Marshall Plan was just giving economic support to rebuild Europe and contain communism. All of our allies and even some of our former enemies, the United States was trying to prop them up by giving them money. So you look here, this is the United Kingdom. Every stack of dollar bills is like $100 million or something. So the United States gives lots of money to France, the United Kingdom, Norway, Sweden, West Germany, the United States had just been at war with Italy here, Greece, Turkey. And you notice this line right here, we would call that, yeah, that's right, the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union decided not to accept any Marshall Plan money, which is probably convenient because the United States might not have supported the plan had the Soviet Union accepted. So this was one way to fight the Cold War and contain communism. Now, the Soviet Union is not happy about this plan to give money to Western allies. It tries to counteract this by embarrassing the West with West Berlin. So the Soviet Union sets up a blockade. They don't allow any traffic to come into Eastern Germany here so that the Allies can't support its territory of Western Berlin. They blockade it. They put up their tanks right here. Okay, so once the tanks are there, the United States doesn't want to just give the Soviet Union the victory of allowing West Berlin to become Soviet. So they come up with a technological solution to get around the blockade. They fly over the blockade. That way, if the Soviet Union decides to shoot at American ships, they have started the war. The United States is not the aggressor. So the United States and France and Britain use their airplanes to fly over the blockade, drop supplies into West Berlin, and then fly back out to their territory. Now, the United States wins this initial conflict, but it embarrasses Stalin. Stalin thought they had a trump card that he could play against the West, and now the West has overcome it. Stalin doesn't want to start a war either. They just lost 24 million people. But he decides that to counteract this, he's going to build up his conventional weapons forces. He builds tanks and planes and bombs and all that stuff. So this leads to an arms race, a conventional arms race between the Americans and Stalin and the Soviet Union. Once the two sides have started to form, the United States realizes that it wants to have the ability to protect Western Europe. They start an alliance known as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the United States is leading this defensive organization. This is different than the United Nations. This is a military defensive pact against the Soviet Union. And it's a defensive shield in the sense that an attack against one country would be considered an attack against all countries. The Soviet Union, recognizing this, is going to organize its own version of NATO that it's called the Warsaw Pact later on. As the Cold War goes on, this becomes more and more important because as the Soviet Union develops nuclear weapons, an attack of a nuclear nature against any one of these countries would be considered a nuclear attack against the United States. So the United States starts to act as a missile defense shield for Western Europe, because the Soviet Union knows that if they use nuclear weapons against Western Europe, then the United States will use all of its nuclear weapons on the Soviet Union. The United States does reorganize its military as well. The United States creates something called the National Security Council, or the NSC, still very important in our modern political system. They advise the president on military matters, and the United States creates the Central Intelligence Organization or Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, as a way to gather information and do other things outside of American borders. Inside the American borders, the United States creates the FBI to kind of police the internally for federal things. Outside of the borders is the CIA to do things like gather information and other nefarious deeds. Speaking of post-World War II, one of the most important elements that emerges is the nation of Israel for the United States. If you remember, we talked about in the 1920s, the United States was very embarrassed by the fact that it did not support the Jewish people, the Jewish refugees who were trying to leave Germany as Hitler built up his power base and started attacking and scapegoating Jewish people in Germany. After the war, the United States supports the creation of Israel. Now, Israel is going to become a Jewish homeland in the Middle East, and biblically speaking, Israel is in its modern territory, where the modern country of Israel is. It has some biblical roots, but the Jewish population had been dispersed in centuries ago and was called the diaspora. So they didn't have a homeland. So the United Nations agreed to, quote unquote, give land to Israel according to a United Nations agreement. If you remember, post-World War I, England still had a large territory, a large colony in the Middle East known as Palestine. England gave that territory of Palestine to Israel. The United Nations separated the country into an Israeli territory and a Palestinian territory. It's going to anger many people of Arabic heritage in that territory because they felt that their land was being taken away. Israel is created. You can see here, this is in 1946, 1947, 1967. We're going to talk about why this is later. And then by 2010, this is what Israel looks like. It's a little different now, but still basically the same. 1947, they're splitting Israel and Palestine into two countries. You can tell already that this is going to be awkward because of the way that they have it split up. This is going to cause a lot of problems in the Middle East that the United States will have to deal with later on. The United States became its first and most important supporter and is going to be very important in its national defense, which is going to anger a lot of Arab people in the Middle East. All right, let's talk about the New Deal. After World War II, there's this fear that the Great Depression might return with the end of the war. Demobilization leads to an end of those military contracts. We're transitioning back into a civilian economy. There was fear that the economy would go back into the Depression. There were some early labor unrest. Wages and prices were wonky. So the United States needed a plan to deal with coming off of those World War II ration and price controls. Because coming off of the rations and price controls, people had a lot of money to spend, which meant they went out and spent it, which means there wasn't enough stuff. And you remember our supply and demand curves. This leads to inflation. And inflation that the wages couldn't keep up with. And because wages couldn't keep up with it, that led to a number of strikes, which meant labor unrest. So the United States needed a plan, and it came up with a plan to offset some of these big issues by expanding New Deal programs. And this is going to lead to what's often called the Great Boom or the Long Boom. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the United States economy expanded at one of the greatest rates ever. And we'll talk about how the United States got through some of that stuff in a minute. But first, let's talk about civil rights. The Soviet Union was using civil rights as a weapon against the United States. The Soviet Union was showing the ways that the United States was an unequal nation, and they were using it as a propaganda tool. Part of World War II, remember, was the Double Victory Campaign. As part of the Double Victory Campaign, the African-American soldiers that went off to war were coming back, and they were going to fight for equality. This plays into that Soviet shaming propaganda plan. People in certain areas were also feeding into this because they were not able to get past their white supremacist tendencies. A couple of examples of this: in South Carolina, we have the blinding of Sergeant Isaac Woodard. And basically, Isaac Woodard was a returning veteran. He was coming from Georgia, driving through South Carolina to get back to his home. He was on a bus, and the bus driver didn't think he was being respectful enough. So when they got to the next town, they pulled over. The police were called. The police, unhappy that this African-American man was wearing a U.S. Army uniform, ends up beating him, taking him to a prison, beating him more, to the point where they actually blinded him. They broke his eyes. This leads to a huge outcry. There's several other events. For example, there's a lynching in, I believe, Alabama, where it became very public, and there's this large outcry. We just fought a war against evil racist Nazis, and the United States is taking these racist actions, and the Soviet Union is using those racist actions as a ways to make a coup, a propaganda coup against the United States. So Harry Truman, as a Democrat, which is interesting because the Democrats have been the party of white supremacy in the South, Harry Truman, a Democrat, takes steps to fight back against the racial problems. Harry Truman pushes through I believe is an executive order to desegregate the Army, further desegregates the federal government. So it takes these radical steps of integrating the armed forces. There is a backlash against this in the South. Southern Democrats, which supported Jim Crow laws, do not want integration. They're going to be pro-segregation. And the Southern Democrats form an organization called the Dixiecrats. Now they're starting to pull away from the Democrats over the issue of civil rights. One of the leaders of these Dixiecrats was South Carolina's own Strom Thurmond. So we're going to see how the Dixiecrats are going to keep pulling away from the Democratic Party, and how eventually the Democratic Party is going to be the party of the civil rights movement, and the Dixiecrats are going to go off on their own. Eventually, they're going to be pulled into the Republican Party. A little bit more on civil rights in the 40s. We know a little bit about Jackie Robinson. He's the baseball player. Please remember, though, that Jackie Robinson was more than just a baseball player. He was a very strong civil rights advocate throughout his entire life. In fact, Jackie Robinson was court-martialed while he was in the military during World War II, prior to his time in baseball, because he refused to sit in the black section of a bus. So there's an interesting thing there. Mexican Americans are going to fight for civil rights during this time period. During World War II, Mexicans had been invited in what was called the Bracero program to come into the United States in order to do the jobs that were vacated by white Americans, especially in the Southwest, doing things like migrant farm laboring. The Truman administration came up with the Fair Deal, which was trying to expand New Deal programs. They came up with a plan for universal health care, which was largely thrown out, a plan for union protections, a plan to increase Social Security and minimum wages, a plan to promote equal rights and end segregation. Some of those are implemented, but not to the extent that they had hoped. The Cold War heats up in the late 40s going into the 1950s. One of the biggest events was when China became communist. Led by their chairman, Mao Zedong, the communists won the Chinese Civil War against the Chinese nationalists who had been led by Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists flee from China, which is now controlled by the communists, and go to the island of Formosa, which they begin calling Taiwan. And for about 20 years, the United States never recognized communist China. Whenever they did anything, for example, with the United Nations, China was always the island of Formosa, Taiwan. That was officially China. That's going to become a big deal later on when the United States formally recognizes communist China. There is a fear of communist expansion within Asian territories, which is going to lead to something that we're going to call the domino effect, which is going to be an expansion of that containment policy. In 1949, the Soviets develop atomic weapons. The United States loses its nuclear monopoly. With the loss of the nuclear monopoly, a lot of the strategy, a lot of the foreign policy that the United States had based its post-World War II diplomacy on is suddenly gone. They can't threaten the Soviet Union anymore with using atomic weaponry. Now they have to consider the fact that the Soviets have atomic bombs. The United States becomes terrified that it has fewer atomic weapons than the Soviet Union, and it leads to a nuclear arms race. By the mid-1970s, there's enough nuclear weapons on the planet to annihilate life on Earth by 7 times. This becomes what was the policy, the way that Americans thought about nuclear weapons was referred to as mutually assured destruction. When you combine NATO and the Soviet Warsaw Pact, all of a sudden you have two groups that could blow each other literally out of existence. This mutually assured destruction meant that if one side ever chose to use the bomb, the other side would use all their bombs, which meant that everybody would die. So if everybody would die, then nobody would be stupid enough to use the bomb the first time. It's the thing that keeps nuclear war in check throughout the entire Cold War period. The United States and the Soviet Union do not want to fight because they're worried that if anyone decided to use the bomb, they'd be done. So they avoided a hot war. They avoided fighting each other directly out of fear that that would lead to nuclear weapons. Or as Albert Einstein said, I don't know what weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. An example of this war through your allies is the Korean War. So 1948, North Korea invades South Korea. The United States does not want to directly confront the Chinese or the Soviet Union, but they don't want communist expansion in Asia. They're worried about that domino effect. They're worried about the growth of communist power. So rather than directly fight North Korea, the United States gets a United Nations police action. They are able to get the United Nations to condemn the Korean actions and send United Nations forces, which are led by the United States, but it's a coalition effort to try to push the North Koreans back to their border. You can see in this map here that North Korea invades, gets the South Korea all the way down here into this blue zone, and then from there, the United Nations comes in and starts pushing back. You see MacArthur and the United Nations forces start pushing back against Korea, and you can see that the North Korean forces fall all the way back to this dotted line right here. So the United Nations is successful there, but once the United Nations gets too successful, by mid-1950, China threatens to enter the war. This would be 1 billion people that were going to be put to bear on the United States and the United Nations. So the United Nations falls back, and what they get is a line right here in 1953. So the North Koreans fall back. So the South Koreans and the United Nations fall back. North Korea settles here, and this is the line that's going to stay in place until now. When you're watching this video, this line is still in effect. Now, this was the same line that the war started at, which means after all of the death and after all of the fighting, the United Nations and the United States settled on a border that was almost exactly the same as what it had been before the war. And the United States called this a victory because they had contained communism. There's a ceasefire. And that means they stop fighting. The United States does not get an end to the Korean War until the election of Eisenhower, who goes in and eventually they set that border. 33,000 dead, 2 million South Koreans dead, 3 million South Korean casualties. And it's a victory for containment. The United States then also decides to assist the French in Indochina, which we are going to call Vietnam. As a result of all of this fear of communist spread, this fear the United States is falling behind, this fear that the United States has lost its nuclear monopoly, this fear leads to a second Red Scare. We talked about our first Red Scare in the 1920s. The second Red Scare is in the 1950s. And we're going to eventually refer to this as McCarthyism, because the guy that starts it, his name is McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy of Western Virginia. Now, we have to understand a little bit about politics here. The Republicans have not been in the president's office, haven't controlled the presidency since before the Great Depression. So Herbert Hoover in 1929. It is now 1948. and never mind, 1950. I'm sorry, 1950 election. So they want to have somebody in office that's a Republican, and they want to make Harry Truman look bad. So the Republicans are going to accuse the Democrats of being weak on communism. If we look at the political spectrum, Democrats tend to be a little bit further along the line towards socialism than Republicans, who are a little bit less interested in that concept. So the Republicans are going to accuse the Democrats of sympathizing with communists, and they're going to blame Truman for being too weak on communism, thus leading to the Red Scare. Truman tries to fire back. He creates something called the Loyalty Oath Program. The Loyalty Oath Program said that anybody that was in government had to swear allegiance to the American system. The problem with this is it made it seem like the Republicans were telling the truth, that there were communists that were in the government, communists that were trying to undermine America. And Truman, by having this Loyalty Oath Program, kind of fed the flames rather than snuffing it out. This leads the Republicans and, frankly, members of Congress on the Democratic side as well, creating something called the House Committee on Un-American Activities, also known as HUAC. HUAC's job was to root out communists in several different places, ideally the government, but also in anywhere that communists were undermining America. The one place that they targeted, because it would bring them eyeballs to their situation, and they wanted to meet celebrities, they focused on Hollywood, and they find the Hollywood 10. As they started calling people into the HUAC committees, they would ask for names. Whether the names were accurate or not, they were just trying to find names that they could bring in to be questioned. HUAC finds these 10 members of Hollywood, authors, mostly screenwriters, some actors, to testify, and they refused to testify, saying that they had the First Amendment right to say whatever they wanted in their movies. They did not have to give up anybody as a communist because it was against their free speech. These 10 are going to be blackballed, and it's going to lead Arthur Miller to write the play The Crucible, or Crucible, I don't know how to say it, which was really an allegory for McCarthyism. It's a witch hunt. There really aren't any witches, just like there aren't really any communist sympathizers within Hollywood or in the government, and yet they're desperately searching for them, and they're making wild accusations that really don't pan out. Let's see. There were a few spies, which feeds into this mythology, or not mythology, but feeds into the fear. One spy was Alger Hiss, who was guilty of espionage. The Rosenbergs were passing nuclear secrets to the Soviets. They're going to be put to death. This just fuels that fear-mongering, and this is where McCarthy comes in. McCarthy used the policy or the tactic known as the big lie. He would just keep repeating something over and over and over again to the point where people said, well, if he's saying this in public, it must be true. And so then something would get pointed out that wasn't true. And they're like, well, maybe the whole thing wasn't true, but where there's smoke, there's fire. There must be something to this. And then he would just keep committing these accusations over and over and over again until eventually people would be discredited, their reputations were ruined, and McCarthy became famous. He became a important person in Congress, even though he was a very young person. It turns out that he was lying about almost everything, and that he didn't have any names, that he was just accusing people to make himself look better. And you can see in this cartoon here, he had faked doctored information, including letters and photos. But the damage was done. This lasts for a couple of years, where these false accusations were silencing people's free speech. These false accusations were ruining people's reputations, and the Red Scare just continues on and on. Civil liberties were being violated in the name of people's security. McCarthyism ends, but McCarthyism ends during the Eisenhower presidency because he accuses the army of being full of communists, and Eisenhower puts him on TV. in what are known as the Army McCarthy hearings. And McCarthy looks like a bully and a drunk, and eventually he is discredited by people seeing what actually was happening. The fear of communists lasts well into the modern era, and is one of the ways that policies often get killed is by people calling them socialists. So this has a long history that's going to last into the modern era.